The courthouse wedding lasted 6 minutes. Grace wore a dress she found on clearance the night before. Cream lace, modest sleeves, a size too big. Ethan Cole, the man she was to marry, didn't bother with a tie. He stood beside her like a statue, his gray eyes unreadable, his answers clipped. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Ethan offered his hand, not a kiss. Grace took it anyway. It wasn't love. It wasn't even it was an arrangement, a quiet agreement between two broken people. She needed to disappear from her old life, and he needed a wife. Ethan didn't speak the entire 3-hour drive north. Grace sat beside him, her fingers tightening around her purse strap, silently rehearsing all the things she wouldn't say. No mention of Luke. No talk of betrayal. She had promised herself this marriage would be the clean slate she needed. Not a beginning built on romance, but on escape. They reached Blackthorn Manor at dusk. The estate loomed at the top of a craggy hill, half swallowed by fog and the wild woods behind it. Ivy strangled the stone exterior. The windows reflected no light, only shadows. Grace expected something grand and warm, something that whispered of a fresh start. Instead, the house seemed to exhale something old. Forgotten. Watching. Ethan said only, "We're home," before unlocking the heavy front door. It groaned open, and a rush of cool, earthy air swept past them. Inside, it was colder than the autumn air outside. The grand entry was all dark wood, high ceilings, and silence. Paintings lined the walls, mostly landscapes, but above the stairs hung a single portrait of a woman. Dark hair, distant eyes, pale hands folded over her lap. Grace felt the hairs on her neck rise. No one greeted them, no staff, no welcome. Ethan gestured to a winding staircase. "Your room's upstairs, last door on the left. I'll sleep in the west wing." "Where are the kids?" Grace asked, her voice more tentative than she meant it to be. Ethan paused. "They keep to themselves." That night, Grace tried to sleep in her new room, but the mattress felt like sleeping on stone, and the silence outside her door was deafening. Somewhere down the hall, she thought she heard soft footsteps. Too light for Ethan. Too slow to be casual. She crept out in her socks, heart pounding, drawn to the sound. It stopped when she reached the middle of the hallway. She waited, holding her breath. A door at the far end creaked open. Just a sliver. She took a step forward. Then, two wide eyes, child-sized, peeked out from the darkness. A boy. Thin. Silent. Behind him, a smaller figure cowered. A girl, maybe 6 or 7, clutching something to her chest. Grace smiled gently and crouched. "Hi, I'm Grace. I guess I'm your new stepmother." The boy said nothing. The girl whimpered and pulled him back into the room. The door shut with a soft click. Grace stood in the dark hallway, a hollow ache blooming in her chest. The next morning, she woke to an empty house. No breakfast smells, no laughter, no sign of Ethan. She wandered the halls alone, the only sound her own footsteps on ancient hardwood. Several doors were locked. One, at the end of the east wing, had a thick iron bolt across it. When she reached for the handle, something cold brushed her hand. Not the air. Something else. She yanked her hand back. Ethan appeared beside her, silent as a ghost. "Stay out of there," he said. "What's in that room?" He didn't answer, just turned and walked away. By the end of the second day, Grace realized this wasn't a new beginning. This was exile, a life where no one spoke, no one smiled, and the walls were thick with secrets. At night, she lay in bed listening, hoping for the children's voices, some hint of curiosity, even a cry. But all she heard was a steady, rhythmic tapping from the floor above, like fingernails on wood. Tap, tap, tap. She told herself it was the house settling. She told herself she was safe. But the longer she stayed in Blackthorn Manor, the more she sensed something was waiting for her. And it had been waiting a long, long time. The third night was worse. The house refused to sleep. And soon, so did Grace. Blackthorn Manor came alive after sunset, not with life, but with presence. The kind that made her skin prickle when she stepped into certain rooms. The kind that made her glance over her shoulder with no one behind her. The quiet was never truly silent. It breathed, hummed, creaked with restless energy. That evening, Ethan joined her for a silent dinner. The dining room was massive, with a chandelier that hadn't been dusted in years and a table long enough to seat 20. Grace sat at one end, Ethan at the other. Two untouched place settings sat in the middle, smaller, child-sized. A cruel joke or a sad habit, she couldn't tell. She tried to engage him. "How long have the children been homeschooled?" "They're not," he replied without looking up. She blinked. "They don't go to school?" "They haven't left the property since their mother died." Grace let the silence linger, then asked more softly, "Do they speak to you?" Ethan put down his fork. "Not often." He rose before she could ask more and disappeared into the west wing, like smoke vanishing through a crack. That night, the sounds began again. She lay still in bed, eyes wide open in the dark. Just past midnight, she heard the muffled patter of footsteps above her ceiling, child-sized again, but quick and scattered, like someone running. She sat up, pulse quickening. Then came the tapping. Tap, tap, tap. This time, it came from the wall behind her bed. Grace turned. The sound stopped. She climbed out from under the heavy covers and approached the wall. There was nothing. She pressed her hand to the faded wallpaper. It was cold, damp even. Tap. Her fingers jerked back. She took a breath. "Hello?" No answer. Only silence. Then, just as she turned to leave, she heard it. Whispering. Very faint. Like a conversation, just beyond the wall. Not words, exactly. More like tones. Voices layered over one another in a language that wasn't hers. She stepped back and did what she had promised herself she wouldn't do. She opened her bedroom door. The hallway was dark. No light but the moon stretching in through the stained glass window at the far end, casting jewel-toned shadows on the floors. Grace stepped out slowly, her nightgown whispering against her legs. A door creaked open behind her. She spun. The children's room. The door was ajar again, just like the night before. Grace crept toward it. This time she knocked softly. "Can I come in?" No answer. She gently pushed the door open. The room inside was dim, lit only by a single oil lamp flickering on a high shelf. The boy, Henry, sat upright in bed, staring at the corner of the room. The little girl, Celia, sat curled under the blanket, clutching a worn rabbit with one ear missing. Grace stepped in, slowly. "I just wanted to check on you." Henry didn't look at her. "She comes at night." Grace froze. "Who?" Celia shivered and hid under the blanket. Henry's voice was hollow. "The lady in the mirror. We're not supposed to look at her." A cold dread crawled up Grace's spine. "Who told you that?" She did. He finally looked at Grace, and what she saw in his eyes made her stomach twist. It wasn't just fear, it was acceptance, like this had been his reality for far too long. "You can't help us," he said softly, "unless you hear her too." Grace stepped back, her breath shaky. "Go to sleep, you're safe now." Henry didn't answer. The next morning, Ethan found her in the library, eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. "I heard them walking last night," she said quietly. "Were they?" "They sleep through the night," he said curtly, not looking up from the book he was pretending to read. "You're letting this house get to you." Grace leaned in, voice lower. "Henry said something about a woman in the mirror." Ethan's expression shifted, just slightly. His jaw tightened. "Children say things," he said. "It doesn't mean anything." "Then let me help them." He looked at her finally. Help them by leaving it alone. Then, without another word, he stood and left her in the vast, cold silence of the library. But Grace knew, deep in her bones, that something was terribly wrong, not just with the house, with Ethan, with the children, with the silence that wrapped around this place like a second skin, and worst of all, with whatever waited, patient and invisible, inside the walls of Blackthorn Manor. By the end of her first week at Blackthorn Manor, Grace could no longer ignore the tightening in her chest every time she walked down the east wing, or the sensation that something unseen passed just behind her. The children remained silent shadows. Ethan stayed buried in closed-door meetings with old books and older liquor. The silence, she thought, had teeth. She needed to breathe. On a crisp Thursday morning, she asked for the keys to the truck. Ethan barely glanced up from the study. "What for?" "I need to go into town. Supplies, I'm running low on things." He hesitated, then tossed the keys onto the desk. "Don't talk about the children," he said flatly. "Or me." The warning wasn't necessary. Grace had no desire to open any more doors than she already had. Blackthorn Village was a 20-minute drive from the estate, nestled between tangled woods and low hills. It was picturesque in a way that felt frozen in time. Red brick storefronts, hand-painted signs, a single crumbling church bell tower casting long shadows on the cobblestones. She parked near the bakery, stepped out, and felt eyes on her instantly. It was subtle at first. Two older women whispering behind a flower stand, a man pausing mid-step with a parcel in hand. Grace tried to smile, tried to appear harmless. She had no idea her presence had already stirred a long-buried fear. Inside the general store, a little brass bell announced her arrival. The shopkeeper, a woman in her 50s with weathered hands and a stiff smile, looked up from behind the counter. "Good morning," Grace said, selecting a basket. "I'm new to the area." The woman stared at her for a moment, then nodded. "You're from Blackthorn." It wasn't a question. "Yes," Grace said, carefully placing canned soup and candles into the basket. My husband is Ethan Cole." The woman's expression didn't change. If anything, her face paled slightly. "You poor thing," she said under her breath. Grace looked up. "Sorry?" But the shopkeeper said nothing more. She merely rang up the items in silence. As Grace pulled out cash, a hand brushed hers. She turned, startled, to find a teenage girl, no more than 16, standing beside her. The girl didn't meet her eyes. She slipped something into Grace's palm and walked quickly out the door. Grace looked down. A folded scrap of yellowed paper, faint handwriting in pencil. She never left that house alive. Her blood ran cold. "Who wrote this?" Grace asked sharply, but the shopkeeper had already turned her back. Outside, Grace scanned the street. The girl was gone. She returned to the truck shaken, clutching the note like a secret that burned her fingers. Once safely inside the cab, she unfolded it again, heart pounding. The writing looked rushed, desperate. But there was something else. On the back, faint ink smudges, like it had been scribbled on top of another page, and a partial signature. A C? Maybe CL? It trailed off. Back at the manor, Grace found Ethan in the garden, pruning roses with quiet violence. "Who was your wife?" she asked directly. He paused but didn't look up. "Her name was Margaret." "What happened to her?" "She died. Illness." "Of what?" Ethan turned. "That's enough, Grace." "No," she said, emboldened now. "Because the villagers aren't treating me like a newcomer. They're treating me like a ghost. And someone left me a note saying your wife never left this house alive." His eyes darkened. "Don't bring them into this." "Into what?" Ethan stepped toward her, jaw clenched. "My wife died in this house. It was tragic, but it was natural." Grace stared at him. "Then why won't the children say her name?" The wind shifted. Something rustled in the trees. Not leaves, something heavier, like fabric dragging through underbrush. Ethan looked away. "Some things are better left buried." Grace stood her ground. "She wasn't buried, was she?" A long pause. Then, "Stay out of the east wing, Grace." And he walked away. Later that night, Grace stood before the bolted door at the far end of the east wing. Her hand hovered over the latch. Behind it, the air felt heavier, denser, as if something on the other side had leaned forward to breathe in her scent. She never left that house alive. The words rang in her ears. And for the first time, Grace wondered, had she walked into a marriage or into a mausoleum? It was during a thunderstorm that Grace finally earned the children's trust. The storm rolled in just after dusk, thick clouds blotting out the moon. Lightning flashed behind the manor's tall windows, throwing stark shadows against the stone walls. The wind howled like a chorus of mourners. Grace, alone in her bedroom, counted the seconds between lightning and thunder and tried to ignore the feeling that something had begun watching her more closely. She had just begun to doze off when a soft knock rattled her door. 3 gentle taps. Then silence. She pulled on her robe and opened it to find Celia standing there barefoot, soaked and shaking, her stuffed rabbit clutched to her chest. I can't sleep," the little girl whispered. Without a word, Grace knelt and opened her arms. Celia dove into them. They sat on the floor together, huddled under a blanket. Grace brushed damp hair from the girl's face. "Do you want to talk?" Celia shook her head. "Is it the storm?" Another head shake. Grace looked down at her. "Is it her?" Celia didn't speak. But after a long pause, she pointed. Grace followed her finger to the vanity mirror across the room. A long, lightning-lit crack zigzagged through its center. "She's angry tonight," Celia whispered. Before Grace could respond, another sound interrupted them. A sharp creak, floorboards outside in the hallway, then a soft, childlike gasp. Celia stiffened in her arms. "Henry." Grace rose and opened the door. There stood Henry, pale, drenched, and wide-eyed. "She's in our room." Without hesitation, Grace took both children's hands and led them to their room, heart pounding. The hallway lights flickered overhead as thunder rumbled directly above them. The door to the children's bedroom stood ajar. Inside, the beds were unmade, the curtains violently blowing despite the windows being shut. And on the vanity mirror, drawn in condensation, was a single symbol, a circle with lines spiraling out like a sun or an eye. Celia whimpered. Grace closed the door. "We're sleeping in my room tonight." Back in her quarters, she laid them in the large bed and wrapped them in layers of wool. After she was sure they were safe, she lit a candle and fetched the first aid box from the bathroom. The children hadn't changed clothes. Henry's shirt clung to his back. "Let's get you dry," Grace said, trying to keep her voice steady. She peeled off the shirt and froze. Across his back were bruises, not fresh, but deep, sickly purple, shaped in jagged patterns. Not like punches, not like belt marks, like claw marks. "Henry," she whispered, trying to control the tremble in her voice. "What happened to you?" "I don't remember," he said flatly. "That's not from falling," she said gently. "Did your father?" "No," he said quickly, almost angrily. "Not him." Grace looked to Celia. "Did something do this to you too?" The girl nodded, eyes brimming. "Where?" Silently, she lifted the hem of her nightdress to show matching clawed marks across her ribs, some fresher than Henry's. "I thought you said she was gone," Grace whispered. Celia looked at her gravely. "She's not." Henry sat up and rummaged through a small tin box by the bed. He pulled out 3 sheets of paper and handed them to Grace. They were drawings, dark, chaotic pencil strokes. A woman, faceless except for hollow, cavernous eyes peering through cracked mirrors. Another sketch of the woman with hair like black fire, standing behind Ethan in the library while he read. And the third, chilling in its simplicity, showed Grace herself asleep in bed, while the woman stood at the foot of it with long, inhuman fingers stretched toward her. Grace clutched the papers. "When did you draw these?" "We don't draw them," Henry said. We wake up and they're there. Celia nodded. Sometimes under the bed. Sometimes under our pillows. Grace looked between them. Have you told Ethan? The siblings exchanged a look. He won't talk about her, Henry said. He says we're imagining it, Celia added. But we're not. You believe us, don't you? Grace knelt beside the bed and took their hands. Yes. I believe you. Outside, the storm howled. Inside, the candle's flame wavered as if something unseen had just passed beside them. Grace tucked the children in, but she didn't sleep that night. She sat in the armchair, watching the mirror. Waiting. And just before dawn, as the thunder began to fade and the rain softened into mist, she saw it. A single handprint pressed into the fogged mirror, 5 long fingers. Too high to belong to either child, too thin to be Ethan's. And it was facing inward, as if someone inside the mirror had been trying to get out. The next morning, the storm had passed, but the house felt no calmer. In fact, Grace sensed something new in the air, something expectant, like the manor itself was holding its breath. After breakfast, Ethan left without a word, as he always did. The children had gone quiet again, retreating into themselves after the revelations of the previous night. Grace didn't push them. She needed time to think, and to search. She was beginning to suspect the house knew more than Ethan ever would. That afternoon, she wandered into the library. The room was vast and dim, lit only by streaks of gray light that filtered through high, grimy windows. Dust coated the shelves like snow, disturbed only in certain places, rows Ethan had recently scoured. There were gaps where books had been removed, piles that hinted at frantic research or ritual. She recognized old texts on folklore, genealogy, pagan rites. But what caught her attention was the fireplace. Something had recently been burned there. Ash still clung to the grate, and the air smelled faintly of scorched parchment. Grace crouched and sifted through the remains with a fire iron. Beneath the top layer of ash, something hadn't caught fire completely. A folded envelope. The edges were singed, but the name was still legible, written in a careful child's hand. To Miss Grace. Her breath caught. She opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a single sheet of paper, lined, torn from a school notebook. In blue ink, the words scrawled in uneven, urgent strokes. Miss Grace, we don't know you yet, but we picked you. Please come. You're the only one she won't hurt. Please save us before she comes back. Celia and Henry Cole. Dated 4 months ago. 4 months ago. Before she had even heard of Ethan Cole. Before she knew such a man or family existed. Before the matchmaking agency had reached out with its strange, too-perfect proposal. She clutched the letter as a shiver crawled down her spine. How had they known her name? How had they known her? Her knees wobbled as she stood. She tore through the library, checking every shelf, every drawer, desperate for more. At the back of a cabinet filled with atlases, she found a wooden box carved with twisting vines. Inside, more letters. Half-burned, folded, hidden under layers of old newspaper clippings and broken crayons, all addressed to her. Some were drawings. Stick figures of Grace holding the children's hands while the woman with hollow eyes glared from the attic window. Others were full letters, like desperate diary entries. We saw you in the mirror. You were nice to us. She doesn't want you here, but we do. We saw your picture in the book. The one she didn't burn yet. Which book? Grace rifled through the nearest shelves until she found one that stood out, The Brides of Blackthorn. The cover was frayed, the binding cracked. Inside were aged photographs and illustrations of past wives who had lived and died on the estate. Some were drawn, others photographed in antique frames. There were dates, obituaries, strange footnotes, and toward the end of the book, there she was. Grace stared at a sketch of a woman with her same face. Not identical, but eerily close. Labeled only, The Unnamed Bride, Cursed but Chosen. A chill rippled through her. Her eyes fell to the margin, where a child's handwriting had added, "This is her. We dreamed it." Her image had been here before she'd ever come. The children had dreamed her, written to her, and somehow called her here. Grace backed away from the shelf, mind-reeling. Her entire life had unraveled over the past few years. Loss, betrayal, collapse. She had welcomed this blind marriage because she thought it was a way to start over. But what if it wasn't coincidence? What if she hadn't found the Coles? What if they had summoned her? That night, she gathered her courage and showed the letters to the children. Henry read them in silence. Celia clutched her stuffed rabbit tightly, eyes wet but steady. "We knew you'd come," Henry said finally. "How?" Grace asked. "How could you know me?" "In our dreams," Celia whispered. "Before Mama died, she said she saw someone in the mirror. She said someone was coming, someone who wouldn't be afraid." Grace stared at them, heart pounding. "She said love would be the only thing strong enough to break it," Henry added. "And then you were in our dreams. You looked sad, but not broken, like you'd understand." Grace dropped to her knees before them. "Understand what?" Celia leaned in. "The house doesn't want a stranger. It wants a bride. And you were the only one who wouldn't run." A deep creak echoed through the floorboards above them. All three of them looked up at once. Something had heard. And Grace realized. This marriage had never been about romance. It had been a summoning. She was not Ethan's bride. She was the children's last chance. The morning after uncovering the letters, Grace felt a restless energy stirring beneath the calm surface of the manor. Questions multiplied, like shadows stretching long at sunset. She needed answers, tangible ones. Somewhere in the mansion, a key piece of the past awaited her discovery. The answer came in the form of a single heavy leather-bound journal, half hidden behind a row of dusty tomes in the East Wing's forbidden library, a room Ethan had strictly forbidden her to enter. Now, with Ethan away on one of his frequent errands and the children tucked safely in their rooms, Grace pushed open the creaking door. The air inside was thick with dust and an overwhelming sense of neglect, as though time itself had recoiled from this part of the house. Shelves sagged under the weight of forgotten books, and the fading scent of lilac lingered like a ghost's perfume. She found the journal lying on a low table, wedged beneath a fallen stack of letters. Its cover was cracked and stained, the faint outline of a woman's name embossed in gold, Margaret Cole. Grace's fingers trembled as she opened the book. The handwriting inside was neat, but grew increasingly erratic as she turned the pages. At first, the entries were typical: notes on the estate's upkeep, musings on her children's moods, reflections on her marriage to Ethan. But soon, the tone darkened. Margaret wrote of shadows flickering at the edge of her vision, of whispers trailing through empty corridors, of a weight pressing down on her chest that no medicine could touch. The more Grace read, the clearer it became. Margaret had been tormented by something not quite human. On a yellowed page dated 6 months before her death, Margaret scrawled in desperation, "The house is alive. It feeds on us. It is not satisfied with grief or absence. It demands sacrifice. The bloodline must be sustained. I fear the curse will claim me next." Grace paused, heart pounding. She flipped forward, searching for clarity. The entries devolved into frantic scribbles, mentions of a pact, of feeding the house, of a cycle that must be maintained to protect the children. One page bore a smeared blotch, the dark stain spreading like a stain on her soul. "If I do not comply, the children will suffer. I must keep the darkness at bay, no matter the cost." Grace swallowed hard, feeling the weight of those words settle like a stone in her chest. The woman she had never met was not just a victim, but a prisoner of an ancient family curse, trapped in a role that demanded blood and silence. She turned to the last entry, dated only days before Margaret's death. "They say I am mad, but I see her, the woman in the mirror with hollow eyes. She watches, waits, hungry. I'm the last bride to feed the house, The next will come for me, and if she refuses, the curse will not end. It will consume us all." Grace closed the journal with a snap. The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows deeper. She understood now the true meaning behind Ethan's coldness, the locked doors, the children's terror. Margaret had been ensnared by a legacy far darker than mere grief. The portrait that haunted the hallways was not just a memory, it was a warning. Determined to confront Ethan, Grace found him in the study, his eyes sunken and distant. "Why didn't you tell me?" she demanded. "Why hide her journal?" Ethan's face twisted in pain. "Because some truths are too dangerous. Margaret was trapped by the curse, and so are we." Grace's voice grew stronger. "The children sent for me because they believe I'm their hope. Do you believe that too?" He nodded slowly, a man broken by the weight of generations. "I never wanted to marry again, but they needed someone who could break the cycle." "And what happens if the cycle isn't broken?" she pressed. Ethan looked away, whispering, "The curse will claim the children next. It demands a mother's sacrifice every generation." Grace's mind raced. She thought of the bruises on the children, the strange drawings, the whispers in the walls. "We're not just living in a house," she said. "We're living in a prison, and the walls were closing in." Grace didn't sleep that night. She lay awake in the dim flicker of candlelight, Margaret's journal clutched against her chest. The children asleep in the next room. Her thoughts spun in a dizzying spiral of curses, claw marks, and the suffocating weight of being chosen. When dawn broke, gray and heavy with mist, she found Ethan standing in the garden, staring out at the tree line like he was waiting for something or someone to appear. "I know about the pact," she said quietly. Ethan didn't flinch. He simply sighed, shoulders slumping as though the last bit of resistance had drained from his body. "I suppose you read everything." Margaret wrote it all down. She was terrified. She didn't die of illness, did she? "No," he admitted. "She gave herself to the house." Grace stepped closer. "To save the children." He nodded once. "Just like my mother before her. And her mother before that. It began generations ago, with a promise forged in desperation and sealed in blood." He motioned for her to follow him. Together, they walked into the east wing, where a small, locked door led them down a narrow stone staircase. The air grew colder with each step, heavy with the scent of damp earth and old secrets. The passage opened into a circular room, a crypt beneath the estate. A faded mural adorned the ceiling, a tree with dark, gnarled roots wrapping around a weeping woman. Beneath it, a stone altar stained with age. "This is where it began," Ethan said. "My ancestor, Edmund Cole, was a desperate man. His first wife couldn't bear children. After years of grief and failed pregnancies, she died in despair. He turned to a local mystic for help, and she offered him a solution, a blood pact to secure heirs and protect them." "At what cost?" Grace asked, even though she already knew. "The pact demanded balance," Ethan said. "For every generation of children born into the Cole bloodline, the house would require a mother's offering. If the mother refused, the house would claim the children instead. The pact protected us from illness, misfortune, even death, but only if the sacrifice was honored." "And you knew this when you asked me to marry you?" Ethan's eyes darkened. "I didn't ask. The children did. They found Margaret's journal. They read her warnings. And when the house began to stir again, when the nightmares returned, they sent out letters in secret, hoping for someone who might break the curse instead of surrendering to it." Grace's breath caught in her throat. "And you let them?" "I didn't know," he admitted, voice thick. "Not at first. Then the agency contacted me with your name. It was too perfect to be coincidence. You matched Margaret's sketch. You had no family ties, no children, nothing to anchor you. You were exactly the kind of woman the house would accept. And you brought me here knowing I might be its next offering?" Ethan turned to her then, eyes haunted. "I didn't bring you here to die, Grace. I brought you here hoping you might do what Margaret never could. Love without fear. The curse feeds on fear and grief." That's how it keeps the cycle alive. But love, real, defiant love, Margaret believed it could break the bond. Grace's heart ached with fury and sorrow. You gambled with my life. I gambled with all our lives, he said, because if I hadn't, the house would have taken the children already. The signs are there. Henry's night terrors, Celia's drawings, the claw marks. Margaret was running out of time when she made her choice. I thought maybe this time would be different. She looked around the chamber. The air felt charged, the walls pulsing with something ancient and watching. It's not just a curse, she whispered. It's a living thing. Ethan nodded. And it knows you're here. Grace stepped back from the altar. Her mind raced with Margaret's words, the letters, the children's trembling hands. They believe in me, she said. They think I can end this. Then you may be our last hope, Ethan said, because I can't give them what the house wants again. Not after Margaret. Grace's fists clenched. She'd been pulled into this life by forces she didn't understand. But now she knew the truth. She wasn't just a bride, she was a weapon. And the house had no idea what it had invited inside. It started with the mirrors, a faint shimmer at the corner of Grace's eye, a ripple across her reflection that didn't belong. At first, she blamed exhaustion, stress, the heaviness of truth. But the more she tried to ignore it, the more the mirrors watched her. She would pass the hallway looking glass and see her own reflection pause, just a second too long, after she'd already turned away. Sometimes, in the corners of the ornate frames, she thought she saw strands of dark hair shift, as if someone had just stepped out of view. It wasn't just the mirrors. The house itself grew more alive by the day. The floorboards groaned under footsteps that weren't hers. Cold air pressed down in empty rooms. Doors she knew she'd locked swung open in the dead of night. The scent of lilac, the one from Margaret's perfume, clung to the linens in her room, even though no bottle remained. One morning she woke to find her bed soaked in ice-cold water. The windows were closed. No pipe had burst. No leak explained it. Then came the blackouts. She'd be walking down the hall, and then nothing. A blink, and suddenly she was elsewhere, standing barefoot in the east wing with no memory of how she'd gotten there. Once, she came to in front of Margaret's portrait, her own hands scratched raw, as if she'd been clawing at the canvas. But it was the mirror in the dressing room that finally broke her. She had been brushing her hair before bed, trying to ignore the gnawing sense of eyes on her back, when she looked up and found her reflection smiling. Her lips were still, but the woman in the mirror, her, was grinning. Slow, crooked, unfamiliar. Grace screamed and shattered the mirror with her brush. The children found her huddled on the floor, shaking. Henry pressed his forehead against hers, whispering, "She's trying to get out." Celia added, "She used to do that with Mama, too." "Who?" Grace croaked. "Who's trying to get out?" They didn't answer, but Grace already knew. The spirit of Margaret was not at rest. Her sacrifice hadn't ended the curse, it had only fed it. She hadn't vanished. She'd become part of the house, the latest in a long line of mothers swallowed whole by a promise they never made, but were forced to fulfill. Ethan, too, had changed. He had grown increasingly distant, distracted. Sometimes, he would speak to her in a voice that sounded like his, but wasn't. Lower, colder, echoing with something ancient. One evening, Grace caught him standing in the nursery, murmuring lullabies to no one. When she asked who he was talking to, he simply smiled and said, "She's home." Grace tried to reach him, to pull him back, but it was as if the house had begun to consume him as well. The longer they stayed, the less Ethan belonged to himself. The mansion was feeding, drawing them in, weakening their will. And still the children clung to her, their trust unshaken. Their nightmares were growing worse, their drawings darker. One showed Grace herself, standing before the house engulfed in flames, arms outstretched, as shadowy hands reached out from every window. She knew now what Margaret had meant in her final journal entries. The house wasn't just cursed, it was possessed. Not by a ghost, but by the echo of every sacrifice, every stolen life. a legacy of despair and fear, reborn with each new bride. She wasn't fighting one woman's ghost. She was fighting the soul of the house itself. And it wanted her. That night, Grace lit every candle in the room and watched herself in the cracked vanity mirror. Her reflection flickered like a broken reel of film. At times, she saw herself. At times, she saw Margaret. Her eyes sunken, her mouth twisted in pain or rage or warning. And sometimes, she saw something else entirely. Not a woman. A thing. A presence wrapped in bone and hair, hollow-eyed and bleeding. Whispering promises in a language Grace didn't understand but somehow still feared. "You were chosen," it whispered once, clear as wind through a crack in the window. The only reason Grace didn't break was the memory of the children's letters. Their belief in her, their hope. The house was unraveling her, yes, but it hadn't won. Not yet. Tomorrow she would ask the children what they knew about the chapel they weren't supposed to talk about. The one beneath the house. The one that even Margaret feared. Because if there was a way to end this curse, to face the spirit and survive, it began there. The children had always known more than they let on. It wasn't until Grace confronted them, gently, urgently, that they revealed the truth. Not just about Margaret or the pact, but about the chapel they weren't supposed to remember. The place buried deep beneath the estate, a place where the house breathed. "We found it last winter," Celia said, voice barely a whisper as she traced her finger along a sketch of the spiral staircase in her notebook. "We heard her singing, 'Mama.'" Henry added, "She showed us the way, in our dreams, said we had to find someone who could finish what she started. That someone, they believed, was Grace." She didn't understand why they'd chosen her, why they'd latched onto the idea that she, a stranger with her own broken past, could save them. But when she looked into their eyes, wide and solemn, she saw not naivety but purpose. "They sent the letters," Ethan admitted that night, voice thick with guilt, "slipped them into the mail with fake stamps they made, used the family typewriter. I didn't know until after you'd already arrived." Grace could have raged. Instead, she focused on the one truth that mattered. The children had been calling for help. And now, with the house closing in, they were running out of time. The children led her to the hidden entrance. It was beneath the cellar, past rows of dusty wine bottles and forgotten tools. A loose panel in the stone wall slid back to reveal a descending staircase, carved into the bedrock, so narrow Grace had to turn sideways to pass. At the bottom lay the chapel. It was not the sanctuary she expected, but a ruin, half sunk into the earth, moss-eaten, candle stubs still melted onto the crumbled altar. Symbols she couldn't read were etched into the stone floor in a circle. Bones, small ones, were laid at the perimeter. And in the center, a broken mirror, its glass fractured like a spiderweb. "This is where she did it," Henry said. "Where she tried," Celia corrected. "But she didn't finish. She got scared." Margaret, Grace realized, had tried to defy the house after all, but something had gone wrong. "We can do it right this time," Henry said. "The journal said you have to be inside the circle, that it has to be someone the house wants. That someone was her." Ethan refused at first, terrified that they were awakening forces best left alone. But Grace was resolute. If there was even a chance she could end this, really end it, she had to try. They followed the journal's instructions: salt, mirrors, fire. The children stood at the edges, holding candles. Grace stepped into the center of the circle, heart pounding. They began the chant. The temperature dropped immediately. The candles flickered blue. The ground vibrated beneath their feet like the house was exhaling. From the broken mirror at Grace's feet, black smoke began to rise. Thick, alive, twisting into the shape of a woman. Margaret. But it wasn't her. Not entirely. The figure's face contorted between Margaret's and others. Dozens of screaming mouths, eyes hollow with centuries of suffering. The house was not just haunted. It was a congregation of every sacrifice ever made. Every mother who had died here. Grace tried to hold the chant steady, but the whispers in her mind grew louder. accusing, pleading. Why didn't you save us? Why her, not me? She dropped to her knees, clutching her head as blood trickled from her nose. The spirit shrieked, mirrors along the chapel walls shattering with the force of it. Then everything went dark. Grace fell. In the blackness, she found herself somewhere else. Not the chapel, not the house, a memory. Margaret stood at the altar, tears streaming down her face as she pressed her hands to the floor, chanting the same words Grace had spoken. Ethan stood behind her, holding the children. They were younger, afraid. A choice. Margaret turned to them, smiled once, and stepped into the circle alone. The mirror shattered. Her body convulsed, and then vanished, dissolved into smoke. The spirit had not taken her. She had offered herself. To buy time. To protect the children. To delay the curse. Back in the present, Grace gasped awake on the cold floor of the chapel. Ethan held her, panic in his voice. The children huddled nearby. "It didn't work," Celia said. "We did everything right." But Grace shook her head. "No, we did it wrong. Margaret didn't try to banish it. She fed it willingly, but with love, not fear." The house fed on terror, on sacrifice born of desperation, but Margaret's final act had been something else, an act of choice. And Grace knew now. The curse wasn't broken by banishment. It was broken by transformation. And Grace had one final chance to do what no one before her had dared. The house was dying. The morning after the failed ritual, Grace awoke to the sound of groaning wood and distant cracking, like the walls themselves were in mourning. The air was dense with grief, heavy with rot and sorrow. The mirrors had all gone black. Not shattered, not cracked, just empty. As if nothing could bear to be reflected anymore. Ethan hadn't spoken since the night before. He sat in the children's nursery, unmoving, cradling Margaret's old shawl like it was a lifeline. His eyes were hollow, no longer haunted, but defeated. "The house won't wait much longer," Henry whispered, tugging at Grace's sleeve. "It's hungry again." Celia clutched Grace's hand tightly. "If we don't stop it, we'll be next." Grace felt the truth settle over her like snow. The house had been built on sacrifice, on the blood of women bound by love, trapped by legacy. Each wife taken in fear, each child left behind to continue the cycle. But Margaret had done something none of them had. She'd made a choice. She hadn't fed the curse out of terror. She'd offered herself from a place of fierce love. It hadn't broken the curse, but it had delayed it. Temporarily, the house didn't just need death. It needed surrender. It needed someone to walk willingly into the fire, not be dragged. And so Grace made her decision. That night, as thunder growled on the horizon and wind screamed through the cracks of the estate, she dressed in Margaret's old gown, white with faded lace, smelling faintly of lilac and thyme. She braided her hair with trembling hands. She kissed the children's foreheads and told them she loved them. "Do we have to lose you too?" Celia asked, her voice barely audible. "No," Grace said, kneeling. "I think this time, if it's done with love, not fear, then it doesn't have to end the same way." Ethan appeared in the doorway, stricken. "You can't," he rasped. "Grace, You said it yourself," she cut in gently. "They called me here. Maybe I was meant for this." "You don't know what it'll do to you," he pleaded, voice breaking. "No," she said, standing tall. "But I know what it'll do to them if no one stops it." With the children at her side and Ethan trailing helplessly behind, Grace led them back to the chapel. The ruin breathed around them, pulsing now with raw energy. The altar glowed faintly, lit by an unseen fire. The mirror shards vibrated on the floor like insects sensing blood. Grace stepped into the circle again. But this time, there was no chant. No salt, no candles. Only her. She closed her eyes and whispered the names of the women who had come before her. Margaret, Eleanor, Jane, Clara. She called to them not with fear, but with sorrow, and then with compassion. "I'm not afraid of you," she said into the silence. You were mothers. Wives. Women caught in something you didn't ask for. She opened her arms. You don't have to take any more. I give you this, my love, my strength, my will. The air snapped like a cord pulled too tight. The wind howled. Mirrors all over the estate shattered simultaneously, sending waves of invisible force through the walls. The spirit appeared, not fractured, not raging, but whole. Margaret stood before Grace, her face at peace for the first time. Her eyes brimmed with tears, not fury. And then behind her, others. Dozens, hundreds, all the lost wives. They reached out, not to consume her, but to embrace her. A warmth spread through Grace's body, like sunlight blooming in her chest. The curse recoiled, not because it was destroyed, but because there was no longer room for it. Love had filled the place where fear once nested. The spell was broken. The house let out a final groan, a death rattle, and began to collapse, not in chaos, but as though it had finally been allowed to rest. Ethan carried Celia, Grace took Henry's hand, and together they fled through smoke and ash. Just as they reached the lawn, the east wing gave way and crumbled into dust. By morning, only ruins remained. They stood in the dawn light, soot-streaked and shivering. Grace fell to her knees, overcome. Ethan knelt beside her. I thought I lost you, he whispered. She looked at him, eyes full of exhaustion and something deeper. Rebirth. You did, but I came back. The children wrapped their arms around her. They didn't speak. They didn't have to. Grace had saved them, not just from a ghost or a curse, but from a legacy of fear and silence. She had broken the cycle. The house was gone, but the children were still here, and so was she. Scarred, changed, but free.